Hey, I'm Brian Marok with Beatty USA, and today we're going to walk you through changing a front tire on the rim. So today we're going to use a nice tire stand here to change the wheel, and if you'll notice we have the rim with the rotor side down so that we don't bust our knuckles on that. If you're doing a rear, you want to get the sprocket side down. It's a little bit easier to work with that way and a little bit safer. So first thing we're going to do is let the air out of the tire, and for doing that we're going to use a valve stem remover tool. So now that we've got the air out of the tire, we're going to go ahead and loosen the rim lock. Some people like to take the nut all the way off. I personally prefer to just leave it on at the very top of the threads. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and remove the valve stem nut. So the next step is we're going to go ahead and break the bead loose from the rim so that the tire will drop down into the center and make it easier to come off of the rim. So to do this, we're just going to use our hands on the front tire. It's a little bit easier than the rear, and you're just going to apply a good amount of pressure on the outside of the tire, and you'll notice that it kind of drops down into the center of the rim as the bead breaks loose. And you're just going to work your way all the way around the tire until it's all dropped into the center there. So again, we just want to make sure that the rotor side's down. It's a little bit safer that way. So we're going to flip it back over and start removing the tire with the tire irons. So I prefer to use the longer tire irons out of steel with the nice rounded tip here. It helps prevent damage to the rims, but it also allows you to get that leverage to get the tire off a little bit easier. So we have another option here. If you've got a really nice looking rim, we have a fully plastic tire iron, and it just helps prevent scratching that rim. But it's a little bit shorter, and you just got to use a little bit more leverage and be careful when you're removing the tire from the rim. I actually like to use a little bit of lubricant on the tire to help it come off of the rim easier. So I just apply a little bit around the tire, and that's just going to help the tire slip over the rim. So I personally like to start about 90 degrees from the rim lock. If you'll notice here, we're going to go ahead and get our first tire iron started and make sure that that hook is around the bead of the tire. So we get 2 or 3 tire irons started depending on how hard the tire is. Sometimes it's easier with 3, sometimes 2 just works fine. I like to start with the iron in the middle. That way the other irons don't lose their bite on the tire, and you're just going to apply pressure to the tire iron and allow it to slip the tire right off of the rim there. So you'll notice once I got the tire released there, the inner tire iron comes loose because there's no more pressure, and then we're just going to gently work the other tire irons out so that we don't scratch the rim. Okay, then we're going to continue on. We're going to just go a couple 6 inches past the spot where the tire is on the rim there. We're going to go ahead and insert the tire iron again and get a nice little bite. And as you'll notice, it just easily slides right off of the rim. And we're just going to work our way around slowly, taking small bites. You don't want to work too fast. You don't want to damage or pinch the tube. Okay, so we got to the rim lock here. You'll notice that sometimes it wants to bind up a little bit. So I like to use a separate tire iron. We'll leave the first one in there, and we'll get another one started just on the other side. That way it pops right over top of the rim lock with no issues. Now we have the whole tire off on this side of the rim. We'll go ahead and work on the other side of the rim. So my method is once we have the tire removed on one side, we're going to flip the rim over, and we're going to go ahead and remove it from the other side, and then I'll show you how to pull the tire off of the rim from there. So again, we're going to start about 90 degrees out, and we're going to get a couple tire irons going. Now that that other side is loose, this side should come off with just 2 tire irons pretty easily. Come on. So again, we're going to get to that rim lock. We're going to go back to the 2 tire irons just to make sure that it pops off real easily and comes over the rim. Now this might be a method that a lot of you haven't seen, maybe some of you have. So now that we have both sides of the wheel off of the rim, we're going to go ahead and drop it onto the ground. And you'll notice right away that the rim lock drops into the center of the tire, and you see how much gap we have over here? It's a real easy press once you just rotate that gap to the top. Just give the tire a little bit of effort and it pops right out of the rim. So now we have the tire off the rim, we're gonna wanna go ahead and give it a good inspection and make sure that none of the spokes have damaged the rim strip, or if you have duct tape or some sort of protective rim tape on there. But we're gonna go ahead and look all the way around the rim, make sure that that rim strip is intact and that there's no risk of penetrating the inner tube with a spoke that's maybe too long, or maybe there's some debris in the tire there. We're also going to make sure that the valve stem hole stays lined up for easy installation of the inner tube. So while we were inspecting this rim, we noticed that we have a little bit of a bend here to it. So I'm going to show you a little tip on how to remove that bend just to prolong the life of the rim. So I know most people aren't going to have a crescent wrench this big at home, but you can use the size that you have. I just happen to have this for other jobs on the toolbox there. So we're going to go ahead and get this down to the size that is just a little bit bigger than the rim. And I like to take a microfiber or something and put it over the rim where it's bent, so you try and reduce the damage to it while you're trying to bend that little bit of a ding out. Just get the tip right on there. We're going to make sure it's as tight as you can get it on there, and you're just going to give it a little bit of leverage. You don't want to go too much because you can damage the rim pretty easily, and we're going to move it over and just give it a little bit more of a tweak. And before we go too far, we're going to go ahead and inspect that. So you'll notice a lot of it went out, especially on the side. We did 2 tweaks there. We're going to come back over here, give it one more little bit of leverage and see if we can even it out a little bit more. You'll notice it doesn't take a lot of effort with such a big crescent wrench. You might have to put in a little bit more with a smaller tool. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and install the new tire on the rim. One of the first things I recommend you do is check the rotation of direction on the tire. Some brands have them, some do not. So we're gonna go ahead and look for the arrow on here. This particular tire does not have an arrow of direction, so it can go on either way. We're going to install the tire, and then we're going to put the tube in and install the rest of it on the rim. So again, for ease of installation, we're going to go ahead and lubricate the tire. I just have a light mixture of soap and water in here. If you have stuff at home, I actually like to use window cleaner because it dries and allows that tire to stick. But if you don't have soap, mild mixture handy, window cleaners are good in a pinch. So we're going to go ahead and lubricate both sides of the tire before we put it on the rim. It doesn't take much. You just need a light coating on there just to give it a little lubrication so that it slides over the rim easier. I like to start at the rim lock. So we're going to go ahead and push the rim lock out and make sure that the bottom part of the tire goes between the rim lock and the rim. And we're going to go ahead and push that in as far as we can manually. Then we're going to use a little bit of elbow grease, and we're going to work the bottom part of the tire over the rim as much as you can without putting too much effort into it. You'll notice I'm going to put my hip into the tire here so that it holds it against the rim there and doesn't allow the bead to slip back off. Then we're going to go ahead and grab our tire iron, and working in small bites, we're going to slide it between the tire and the rim, being careful not to scratch the rim. And we're going to go ahead and work that bead over the rim lip there. When you get down to the last section of tire, it's better to put 2 rim locks, or when you get down to the last section of the bead, it's better to feed 2 tire irons in there, because trying to get it in the last 10 inches or so without scratching the rim is very difficult. So we're going to go ahead and get 2 of those started. Of course, that one, it popped on its own. So now that we have the one entire side of the tire installed on the rim, we're going to go ahead and get that inner tube installed. Depending on your riding style, you're going to want to look at your inner tube and choose the right thickness for your preferred discipline. We have a standard style tube here. They come in light duty, heavy duty, ultra heavy duty. Of course, you have bib options as well, but we're just going with a light duty here for a motocross style setup. We're going to go ahead and locate the valve stem hole, which is typically only a few spokes down from the rim lock. And we're going to go ahead and start by feeding the valve stem into the tire and then out the hole. So this can be a little bit difficult for some people. There are special tools that allow you to feed in there and grab the valve stem and pull it through the hole. I just like to use a little bit of good old elbow grease, and you get the valve stem through the hole. At which point we're going to go ahead and grab that valve stem nut and just thread it on a little bit so that that can't be pulled back through. Now that we've gotten to this point, we're going to go ahead and pull the tire up, and we're going to feed the inner tube into the rim. You want to make sure that it goes on top of the rim lock and that it doesn't get pinched between the rim lock and the rim. And you can do that just by feeding your hand in there and making sure it's over the top of that rim lock. And work our way all the way around the tire. Okay, at this point, now that we have the tube all the way in the tire, we're going to take a look at the valve stem, and you might notice it's got a little bit of an angle to it. This is your opportunity to straighten that out before the tire gets seated against the rim. So if you just give the tire a little spin, you'll notice that valve stem will start to line up. You want to make sure that's nice and straight so that when you mount the tire, the valve stem doesn't pull on the inner tube. Another nice little tip I like to do is before we put the valve stem core back into the tube, I like to inject a little bit of an air into the tire. So that allows the tube to conform to the shape of the tire, and there aren't going to be any folds in it that might get pinched with tire irons. We're going to go ahead and shoot a little bit of air in there. I like to save the rim lock for last. So again, I'm going to start about 90 degrees from the rim lock, and I'm going to start feeding the tire over the rim. You want to work in small bites here. You don't want to try and force too much. The tire goes on a lot easier if you take your time and you run less of a risk of pinching the inner tube. So while you're working your way around the tire, as it starts to get tighter on the rim, sometimes it helps to give a little push on the opposite side so that that tire will drop into the drop center of the rim, and it loosens up the tension on the other side. So we're just going to keep working our way around with small bites. At this point, we're going to go over to 3 tire irons because we want to make sure that the tire doesn't slip back off the rim. When you're using these big metal tire irons, you really need to be careful because sometimes they'll come back at you with a little bit of aggression, and they're spring loaded. So feeding that last one in there. Again, you want to make sure that you're not getting the tube in there anywhere. And we're right there at that rim lock. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to push the rim lock up, and that's going to allow for a little bit of a space down in there for the tire to drop into. So there you go. Tires installed fully on the rim. Again, we're going to double check that valve stem, make sure that it stayed nice and straight, and we're going to go ahead and put a little bit of air in there. So before we put the core back in the valve stem, I'm going to go ahead and hit it with some air so that it can seat the bead on the tire. So we're just going to check all the way around, make sure that that bead came up against the rim. Everything's good. And then we're going to go ahead and install the valve core and set the tire pressure. Okay, so we're going to put the valve core back in using the tool. And it doesn't require a lot of torque. You want to just gently get that seated back in there. Once you feel it kind of bottom out, give it a little bit of a turn. Again, it doesn't take too much to get that tight. So we're going to go ahead and set the air in the tire here. And you're going to set that to your desired air pressure depending on the discipline of riding that you're doing. After you get your air into the tire, we're going to put the valve cap back on. And I like to run the valve stem nut up to the valve cap to prevent it from coming loose. So after we get the valve cap back installed and we get that nut tight up against there, we're going to go ahead and torque the rim lock here. So we're going to get the nut down against the rim as tight as you can by hand. Then we're going to grab our torque wrench. And you want to check with your manufacturer on your torque specs, but here we're going to go to about 14 Newton meters. So we're going to tighten that. Okay, so now we've got the rim lock tightened up. The wheel's ready to go pretty much with the new tire. So while you have it loose though, we're going to go ahead and inspect your wheel bearings, make sure that the seals are in good condition, make sure that there's some grease in there, and you also want to maybe go through and check your spoke torques while everything's accessible. Thanks for watching, and I hope these tips help some of you out there do some maintenance on your motorcycles.